He talks quite a bit about listening to your team, listening to your customers, and listening to mentors in the topic. So most of you picked up on that. Thank you for reading the book and participating in this program. We're up to 190 registrations, and appreciate those of you that can log in live and those that are following up on listening to the videos online. This topic of listening comes up in lots of areas. And in fact, when I was looking up jokes, I looked up to see if I could find a couple about listening. And one said, my wife and I were talking about the topic last night, talking so softly. My wife said, "Why are you talking so softly?" And I said, "I'm afraid that Mark Zuckerberg might be listening." And then she laughed, and I laughed, and Siri laughed, and Alexa laughed. So that's an example of listening. There's so much of that going on. We talk about that in the news quite a bit, what all the devices that are listening to us. And then again, last night, my wife and I were having a conversation, and she said, "Are you listening to me?" And I thought, what an odd way to start a conversation. See, that's a joke too, but that's another dad joke. See, listening is talked about both in our society and within our families and within our businesses. It cuts across many different areas. Today, you can be thankful that I am not the one teaching on the topic of listening. Rather, Dr. Pam Dutzman is leading our session on listening today. Pam is the County Engagement Specialist in Christian County, which is the county seat of Ozark, Missouri. I'm not sure how long she's been with Extension, but she's had a great career in a lot of areas. She was a regional director for the American Cancer Society for a while. She worked at Mercy Hospital. She has a nutrition background with Extension and with these other organizations. She now works in community development, helping communities and organizations in those communities make their neighborhoods and their cities a better place to live. She has a PhD and a master's from Iowa State University, but we try not to hold that against her. We still really like Pam and love working with her and appreciate her teaching on the topic of listening today. Pam, it is all yours.
I want both the same.
Oh, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thank you, David. I'm really excited about today's topic, and I want everyone to know that when I was given the opportunity to choose topics I might want to teach for this class, I chose topics not based on my expertise, but because I wanted to learn more about them. So I don't come to you today as a shining example of a great listener, but I did really enjoy preparing for this. And
sometimes, like when I'm in college,
David, if you'd like to go ahead and
put. I'm in college, get me a cute little.
Yeah, if you can, mute yourself, self-mute all.
Rich.
Okay, so you're unmuted now, Pam, and I'll go ahead and share the screen for you.
Excellent.
I'll let you go ahead and begin.
All right, so as I was preparing for today's session, I came across so much material, and it was just really a great opportunity for me to learn just a lot, because it's an area that I would really like to grow in. But I came across a book called The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership, and the author, Stephen Sample, states that the average leader suffers from 3 delusions. One is that he/she is a good driver. 2 is that he/she has a good sense of humor. And 3 is that he/she is a good listener. And so I'm not sure how true that is, but I think it was really meant to make light of a really real leadership dilemma, and that a lot of us might think we're a better listener than we really are. David, if you could go to my next slide.
And obviously, I think I'm a lot funnier than I am. Thank you for bringing that up.
From what I've read during this preparation, communication experts rank listening as the most important skill for a good communicator. And we did spend some time on how important communication is for a leader. But the best leaders are good listeners. And in our chapter today, John Maxwell, he told a funny story at the end of the chapter. If you were able to read it all the way through, he told a chapter about President Theodore Roosevelt, who was attending a gala, and he grew tired of people returning his greeting with stiff small talk. So he began greeting people with a smile, and then he'd say, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." And people would automatically respond with comments like, "How lovely," or "Continue on with your great work." So nobody was really listening to what he was saying, except for one foreign diplomat. When he came along, he said, the president said, "Good evening, I murdered my grandmother this morning." And the diplomat leaned in and responded softly in his ear, "I'm sure she had it coming to her," which I think is just the best story. It's so funny, but it really illustrates how we can be ever hearing, but not really listening to one another. And I think we all remember that noise that Charlie Brown's teacher made when she talked, that wah, 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 wah. And I think that's how we listen sometimes. We kind of tune people out. And some of you right now may be tuning me out and maybe hearing me say wah, 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 wah. I don't know. Hope not. But seriously, today it seems like we kind of live in a world where people really don't listen to each other very well. And several national surveys have shown that many Americans believe this as well, and it can be really frustrating for folks. And I'm sure, like me, you've heard, parents say that their kids never listen, but then kids say their parents never listen, right? And I've heard wives tell me that their husbands never listen, and husbands complain that their wives never listen. And then there's administrators and teachers who've told me that, their students and employees don't listen, but employees often say how their bosses don't listen. So I think everyone can relate to this, but I'm not sure it's causing any of us to make any real changes, to be the first to step forward and make some changes. If you could go on to the next slide, please. I want to start today by asking you to just take a moment to think about someone you know who's a great listener, and get their face in your mind. And think about how you feel about that person. Do you have a greater trust or a greater respect for that person? Think about how you feel when you're with that person. Do you feel respected? Do you feel more connected to that person because they listen to you? I'm trying to see the chat here to make sure I'm not listening to anything. Go ahead to the next slide, David. Okay, I want to take this from a different angle. I'd like to get some feedback in the chat. And it looks like Gidget says that her grandma and dad were the best listeners. That's wonderful. Those are great people to have in your head when you're thinking about that. But I'd like to have some feedback in the chat now about this next question. How do you feel when someone does not listen to you? And think about a time when you were not listened to, and picture that event in your head and type about how that made you feel. Okay, ignored, like you weren't important, disrespected, yeah, unimportant. Like you were wasting your time, yes. And you lose interest in talking to them, yeah, invalid. Really, really good comments. As I've been preparing for this, not valuable. I've been asking this question as well and getting very similar responses. This was mentioned in a previous session, but it's easy to tell when someone is listening to respond versus listening to understand. Yes, that's really true. It's easy to see that. You feel invisible when people don't listen to you. Some of the other things I heard was that it destroys my motivation. Say if your boss isn't listening to you, then we don't feel real motivated to kind of do what they say. It makes me feel disengaged if I'm not listened to. And it makes you wonder maybe what's going on, that they've stopped listening. Yeah. Okay, now the second part of this is I'd like for you to tell me how you feel about that person who is not listening to you. Tell me how you feel about them. You know, maybe you feel something like they're not empathetic, but you do make a judgment of some sort about a person who doesn't listen. Tell me what you think about them in the chat. Yeah, it's hard maybe to respect them, Joanna. Sad or mad. They're arrogant, maybe have a big ego. They don't care, get frustrated. It's unprofessional, yeah. You feel like they're self-centered. Difficult to trust them. Yeah, it's difficult to trust folks who don't listen to us. And I think, you know, the key that we can see from the way Deb Power says, probably choose to not communicate with them very frequently. Yeah, that might be a person you kind of turn the other way. Something's happening inside of them that has caused them to stop listening, William says. I think we could all see from these comments that it's likely we don't see this person as an effective leader. So I think right there we can see the value that if we're wanting to be a better leader, how important this is. Really, no one is going to be following us if we aren't good listeners. Okay, could you go to the next slide, David? So in the things I read, Dr. Ralph Nichols is someone I came across, and he pioneered the science of how to develop good listening skills. I found his work very interesting. His research from the University of Minnesota has been backed up now by a lot of other studies, and it showed the average listener will remember only about 25% of what was said. And this was also mentioned in the TED Talk that David sent out, and that was a really good TED Talk. If you didn't get a chance to look at that, David found a really good snippet, about 7 minutes. It's really quick, but has some really good content in it. But they quote Dr. Nichols as well, and he's quoted as saying here on this slide that the most basic of human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them. So I think we all feel that, we understand that, but I think we're living in a society today where many people seems like they're prepared to be outraged by another person's comments before they even open their mouths. So they're preparing not to listen before they even start talking. And I think we witness this through media of all kinds. People seem kind of determined at times not to listen to one another, to talk over one another, to show some blatant disregard, really, of what's actually being said so that they can get the last word in. And I think William mentioned earlier, you know, thinking to form our response rather than listening to what's actually being said. It's really evident, especially in media, that we see. But really in our culture overall, this is becoming more prevalent. And some people believe that not listening to each other is becoming a cultural norm for America. And I saw several research surveys on this, and it was really interesting. I had never thought of this that way before. But we have a poll now that I think David has prepared, that first poll. If you could pull that up, David. So if you don't agree with someone, this poll is, I listen even if I do not agree with the speaker's ideas or views. So if you could just answer honestly, because this is anonymous, no one's going to know what you're saying, but it would be nice to know how we approach people who we know we're going to disagree with. Do we choose to listen to them? Okay, so we have some pretty open-minded people here. Usually is a good, honest answer. Gidget says sometimes we may hear a new perspective or at least understand where they're coming from. Yes, exactly. All right, David, could you go to the next slide, please? So the surveys I was talking about show that there's this growing culture of incivility in America. And it's not just in politics, but it's in the workplace and kind of society in general. that many are becoming more accepting of this, that we're kind of getting used to it, not listening to each other, or seeing, or witnessing other people not listening to each other like it's normal, it's okay. But when we decide to go that route and not listening to one another to understand each other, I think we all realize that everyone's time is going to be wasted. These conversations aren't going to solve anything, and trust is going to dissolve between relationships, and relationships become strained, and there really is no common ground that can be identified, and no growth toward shared goals whenever we communicate. Yeah, 24 news channels give a terrible example of listening. And it's difficult to listen if they begin a conversation by attacking you, exactly. Because they're not listening. You automatically begin a defense. And Valerie says selective listening is shown on new commentary. So, David, if you could go to the next slide, please. This very same research, this is the part that caught me, and this is the reason it came up in my search. Otherwise, I would never have come across this, but it looked at how to counter incivility. And it turns out that the #1 recommendation was to practice active listening skills, which are shown to increase civility, according to this study, and include remaining calm. Excuse me, I've got a tickle in my throat. Remaining calm while the other person is speaking, maintaining eye contact with the one communicating, putting aside your emotional responses or rebuttal comments to focus completely on the speaker, with the goal to understand their message and then respond thoughtfully. So we have a lot of comments in the chat. It's difficult to listen. Okay, we've got that one. David says, relationships require trust, and trust works best in relationships. We need that just to be able to work together, and that does require us to listen. That's a really, really good comment. Active listeners show the speaker through the way we use verbal and nonverbal communication that we're paying attention, that we're focused and we're engaged. David, if you could go to the next slide. In preparation for today, I came across a fair amount of research on workplace communication. And I thought it was very enlightening for me. I mean, things that we kind of know in the workplace that would make things better. But I did not know that this area of research was out there. But most of it showed a lack of active listening in the workplace. And a quote from one of the studies was, when supervisors forget to practice active listening with their employees, the employees begin to feel as if their opinions no longer matter and that they have no buy-in regarding what occurs within the organization, making conflict inevitable. And I think we all know that in general, there is a rising workplace conflict in many workplaces. But I think that these repercussions could probably be said about any relationship, whether it's family members, friends, or coworkers. I think that if we quit listening, then conflict is going to be inevitable in just about any relationship. David, could you go to the next slide? So on the flip side, this workplace research showed that when good listening was happening, it may be the simplest, most straightforward way to build trust in relationships, simply by listening to someone in the workplace. People began to feel safe to express their opinions. Morale was high, and interpersonal conflict was low when there was good listening being demonstrated. And so it kind of begins to change a culture, and people feel safe and they feel like they can thrive, and good things can start to happen in that culture. Okay, could we go to the next slide, please? So this slide shows some really old and very good advice. And many of us were raised this way, or have tried to raise our kids this way. To be quick to listen, slow to speak, because we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so it's best to listen first before we open our mouths. And habit 5 of the 7 habits of highly effective people Stephen Covey identifies the importance of seeking first to understand and then to be understood. So we've all seen this advice, and most of us for most of our lives. And even though this advice really kind of seems simple and straightforward, it doesn't mean it's easy, right? We're ready for the next poll, David. Okay, so I fidget, play with my watch, my phone, my pen, etc., while listening to someone else. So if you do this, be honest, but be honest and just let us know.
I think there's a pretty big market in just selling little devices, those little fidget things and click cubes and things for people that do fidget. You can get your own fidgeting tool even.
Yes, and whenever you're sitting at a conference, I like to make the excuse that it's helping me listen better. I'm not sure, but that probably wouldn't fall in line with this advice. Okay, most people don't get too distracted with that in our group. That's good. Brenda says, my dad always said, listen, even if you have heard it 100 times, you'll learn something new. That's good advice. And someone says, I doodle at times. Yeah, me too. Okay, so could we go on then to the next slide, David?
Yes.
So one reason that this takes so much effort and we end up doing things like doodling and fidgeting and different things is because our brains are working much faster than anyone can speak. And turns out most of us speak about 125 words a minute, but we're able to understand about 400 words a minute. So even if we are listening, we tend to spend that extra time that we have thinking about other things. It just happens. So someone mentions when communicating with each other, use that person's name. The sound of your name is music to the ear. I like that. Shayla says take notes. And David, taking notes helps me listen. I agree. I love to take notes. But what would make our listening better also is to use that extra time we've got to kind of look at the nonverbal things like facial expressions and body posture and tone of voice and learn to be more intuitive and read between the lines. Most communication is actually nonverbal. So we need to have our nonverbal antennas up. If you could go to the next slide, David. John Maxwell actually encourages us in today's chapter to listen between the lines by listening to nonverbals. Because people say much more with their body language and their facial expressions and their tone than they do with their actual words. So it turns out that about 55% of communication comes through body language and other expressions, and 38% through the tone. And the actual words account for only 7% of the communicated message, which is really quite shocking when you think about it. But we are communicating a lot by our behavior and our tone. Could you go to the next slide, David? Mary says, I'd like to repeat what I think I heard the other person sharing. Yes, I think that's really good active listening skills. So in addition to listening between the lines, John Maxwell gives more tips in the chapter about how to be a better listener. He starts off by saying it's not about you. So I think we've heard this kind of advice throughout the book, that really our focus should be on the other person with all of these behaviors, right? Where it should be about other people before us. And so it's not about us. We listen to learn something new, to connect with the speaker, giving the speaker our full attention with the intention to understand where they're coming from. We might not agree with them, but trying to understand where they're coming from. Charlotte says that A lot can be lost in email messages. We don't have those nonverbal cues. Yeah, really good point. And the tone can come across much differently than it would be in person. I highly agree with that. Emails can be very, very difficult, which is why we should take extra time, I think, to make sure our words are kind and that our tone, if it can come through in an email, is what we want it to be. Maxwell says never be too busy to listen. He encourages us to change our schedule if need be, to never dismiss anyone. He points out that wisdom can come at unexpected times from unexpected people. And he encourages us also in the chapter to listen for opportunities to build connection and to find common ground. And if you think about it, conversation, even if it's filled with conflict, I was involved with something this morning that someone took offense at another person and got involved with that conversation. And when you are involved with something like that, it's just an opportunity for us all as leaders to model how to respond in the right way and use that time to discover and learn and influence in a positive way. But listening shows respect for the other person, and it's one of the best compliments you can pay them. Just listening to them is a big compliment. So it builds goodwill, and like I think I said earlier, it's the best way to build trust and rapport. And then John Maxwell wraps up the chapter by encouraging us to spend time in the coming days and weeks listening with our hearts. And thinking about that, I think what he's saying is if we really care about the other person and care about what they're saying, listening is going to become much more natural, and it's going to be obvious that we're there and that we're focused on them. Cheryl says, how can we get across to younger people that communication cannot be done entirely by text and email because we need those nonverbal cues too? Yes. And Tricia agrees. That might be why we're losing the ability to listen and communicate. Yes. Yes. Deb says, watch people that are using sign language. Their nonverbal cues are key. Yes. That is all I've got, David.
Here's a follow-up question that Valerie has asked. How do you encourage people to listen to you? Which is kind of connected to getting our youth to listen more instead of just texting or emailing. But what are some tips on encouraging people to listen to you?
I think it's really the same way. By listening to them first, by us trying to understand them, they're going to be much more willing to listen to anything we have to say. So I think it's still kind of the same. I think good listening will be reciprocated. When we take the time to listen, then others will know that we can be trusted, and that builds that kind of relationship where they then will begin to listen to us. Jeremy says, ask them questions. That's good.
Or modeling. I think Shayla mentions model for a young person how to listen well. Yeah, modeling's a big part of that. Our tone can really trip us up. And I say that about myself. Tone can be a big issue. Craig adds, as leaders, we should keep our message in mind. We hope and expect that others listen, but if the message is not engaging or dull, it facilitates the listener becoming distracted. So we should make sure our message is always delivered in a way that encourages listening. And sometimes that means keeping it short. There's been all sorts of research about attention spans, and the American attention span continues to decline in length. Part of that may be due to texting and instant messages and things. But I've seen that the average adult attention span now is said to be 4 minutes. So I mean that's not much, especially compared to what it was several decades ago. And everything we're seeing about Zoom is to keep it at 30 minutes or less, or you've lost everybody. So that brings us to our 30 minutes for this session. I I know Pam and I are both happy to stay on if you want to have additional conversations or questions in chat or otherwise. We're glad to entertain those. But thanks again for being with us today, and thanks to our guest, Dr. Pam Deuceman, and the effort she put into researching this topic of listening and presenting it to us. Hope you can take that, think about it, put it into practice in the coming days as we move on to our next topic on Friday. So we look forward to a different guest speaker then, and look forward to having you join us.